No one could have predicted that a 17-year-old Filipino girl would bring down a seasoned law professor in his own classroom, armed only with her sharp intellect and an impeccable memory. The tension in the room was palpable as Professor Marcus Thompson, a man whose reputation for brilliance preceded him, stood confidently before the class. He was a man of ego, accustomed to being the undisputed intellectual authority. No student, in his eyes, could ever surpass his knowledge. But today, things would change. The girl in question, Maria Santos, sat in the back of the room, her dark eyes focused, her posture calm. At first glance, she appeared like any other student, quiet, reserved, blending into the sea of faces. Yet, the professor's challenge would soon expose her true nature. "Let's play a game," Professor Thompson declared with a smirk, his voice full of mockery. "Truth or lie? I'll ask questions, and if you can tell the truth from the lie, you win. If not, you fail. Simple enough, right?" The students chuckled, sensing the professor's dominance in this intellectual game. Maria remained silent, her heart pounding, but her expression betraying nothing. For her, this wasn't just a game. It was a chance to prove her worth, a chance to fight back against the years of underestimation she had endured as a girl from a poor neighborhood in the Philippines. "Are you ready?" Professor Thompson's voice boomed, eager to show his superiority. Maria met his gaze, her mind calculating every possible move, every question that could come her way. The game began. But the stakes weren't what they seemed. The professor had underestimated his opponent. He was about to face a battle far more intense than he had ever imagined. Professor Marcus Thompson had earned a reputation that many students feared and admired, but none dared to challenge. He was a man who prided himself on his unparalleled intellect and his ability to dominate every debate. His voice was a constant fixture in the classroom, and his presence carried an air of unshakable authority. At 50 years old, with a career spanning decades, Professor Thompson was seen as the gold standard in the field of law. His vast experience in the courtroom, coupled with an academic record few could rival, had made him a respected figure. However, that respect came at a cost. He demanded unwavering adulation, and anyone who stepped out of line faced ridicule. He reveled in humiliating students who dared to challenge his knowledge. No question was too trivial to dismiss, no argument too weak to mock. His sharp tongue had cut down many promising students over the years, leaving them embarrassed and often too afraid to speak up again. For Professor Thompson, there was no room for doubt in his classroom. He was the ultimate authority, and to question him was to risk being silenced. Yet, he found something particularly irksome about students who displayed a promise he considered unnatural for their age, gender, or background. Maria Santos, the 14-year-old Filipino student sitting at the back of the room, was one such anomaly in his eyes. Maria had kept a low profile throughout her time at the law school. Unlike many of her peers, she didn't seek attention. Her quiet demeanor and reserved nature made her blend into the background. But beneath her calm exterior lay a mind that far surpassed the level of most students in the class. Maria had a photographic memory, an ability that allowed her to recall even the smallest details with perfect clarity. She had been studying law since an early age, and while others struggled to grasp the basics, she had long since mastered advanced concepts that few even attempted. Despite her brilliance, Maria rarely spoke up in class, preferring to stay in the shadows, quietly absorbing the knowledge that surrounded her. Her reasons for keeping a low profile were deeply personal. Maria didn't want to rely on anyone's validation, especially not someone like Professor Thompson. She knew that to be a woman in law, and a young Filipino woman at that, meant facing doubters and obstacles that others wouldn't understand. She wanted to prove herself, but she wanted to do it on her own terms. Her ultimate goal was to succeed not because of her gender or background, but because of her intellect, which she knew was unmatched. But there was something about Professor Thompson's arrogance that constantly chipped away at her resolve. His dismissive attitude towards her, towards anyone who dared to show promise beyond what he believed to be typical, was a constant reminder of the biases ingrained in the system. His belief that he could trample over students who were beneath him gnawed at her, pushing her toward a breaking point. His ego demanded to be fed, and Maria was beginning to feel like the next victim in his line of conquests. That fateful day, Maria's patience had run thin. It started as just another ordinary class, until Professor Thompson, with his usual smugness, decided to play a game with the students. He called it Truth or Lie, a game where he would pose statements, and the students were expected to discern the truth from the lie. His eyes scanned the room, looking for someone to challenge. He was the master of the game, and everyone knew it. But when his gaze landed on Maria, a smile crept across his face. "Maria," he called out, his voice booming across the classroom. "I'm sure you've got an answer for me. Let's see if you can tell the difference between truth and lie." Maria's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her expression neutral. She had heard the whispers, the way he always singled out students who dared to defy him, but something about his challenge today struck a chord. It wasn't just a game for him, it was a power play, one that would further solidify his dominance. And Maria wasn't about to let that happen, not this time. As she stood up, the room seemed to hold its breath. Maria had never been one to seek the spotlight, but the glint in her eyes now reflected a resolve that was impossible to ignore. This was no longer just about a classroom game. This was about reclaiming her place in a world that had constantly told her she was too young, too quiet, too different to succeed. She would no longer sit back and let someone like Professor Thompson belittle her. The professor's condescending smirk widened, convinced that this would be an easy victory. But Maria was no ordinary student. She had been studying law, reading case studies, memorizing statutes, and analyzing arguments for years. While the professor underestimated her, Maria was already calculating every possible move in her mind. It wasn't about showing off. It was about proving once and for all that she could take him down. As the first question was asked, the room seemed to shrink around them. The tension was rising, and the stakes had never felt higher. "Professor." Marcus Thompson's eyes glinted with amusement as he watched Maria sit at the back of the room, her demeanor so calm and unassuming. It irked him. There was something about her quiet confidence that seemed to challenge his authority without her ever speaking a word. She never spoke in class, barely raised her hand, and yet the other students had started whispering about her. Brilliance. Whispering about how she seemed to know everything. It made him uncomfortable, and he couldn't stand the thought that someone, especially a young girl from a background he considered beneath him, might be outshining him in his own domain. He couldn't let it stand. Today, he would crush that assumption once and for all. With a smug smirk, he turned to the class. "All right, everyone, let's spice things up a bit. A game of truth or lie," he announced, his voice oozing with condescension. The class instantly quieted, their curiosity piqued. Some students, eager to see Professor Thompson's dominance, leaned forward, while others, who had heard the rumors about Maria's intellect, exchanged looks of anticipation. They wondered if this would be the moment the professor finally shut her down. Maria stayed silent, but her heart pounded in her chest. She knew exactly what this was. It wasn't a friendly game. It was a challenge, a test meant to expose her, humiliate her. The stakes were higher than the professor realized, because this wasn't just about proving who knew more. For Maria, this was about silencing the echoes of doubt that had plagued her since she started in law. She wasn't going to let him have this victory, not now, not when she had worked so hard to stay in the shadows. Professor Thompson's eyes locked onto hers, his tone now dripping with a kind of mockery. "Maria," he said, his voice booming across the room, "since you've been so quiet today, how about you play? I'll make a statement, and you tell me whether it's true or false. But I want reasoning, logic, if you will. Think you can handle that?" The class held its breath. Maria's hands tightened around the edges of her desk, but she didn't flinch. She had been preparing for moments like this for years, the ones where the world tried to dismiss her, to overlook her abilities. She wasn't going to let this moment pass without taking a stand. "I can handle it," Maria replied softly, her voice steady. The words were calm, but they carried the weight of something much deeper. She wasn't just responding to the professor's challenge. She was responding to everything that had ever told her she wasn't enough. Professor Thompson raised an eyebrow, clearly delighted by her response. "Very well," he said. "Here's your first statement. The law of contract in the UK is based entirely on the principle of consideration. True or false?" The class exchanged murmurs. This was a standard piece of law, well within the range of what any law student could answer. The professor watched Maria carefully, eager to see her stumble, but she didn't hesitate. She leaned forward, her mind already running through the details she had committed to memory over the years. "The statement is false," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "While consideration is a key element in the formation of a contract, it's not the sole basis. Other principles, like mutual assent and capacity, are essential components. Without these, the contract wouldn't hold up." The room was dead silent. For a moment, Professor Thompson's face flickered with the briefest flash of surprise before the usual smirk returned. "Very good," he said, though his tone was strained. He hadn't expected her to answer so confidently, so quickly. It made him uncomfortable. "You've got one right, Maria, but let's see how you handle this one. Second statement. A person is guilty of manslaughter if they cause a death during the commission of an unlawful act." Maria didn't need to think twice. She knew the intricacies of criminal law like the back of her hand, her mind absorbing each detail with photographic precision. "False," she said firmly. "The unlawful act must be dangerous, and not all unlawful acts will result in manslaughter. It's the specific circumstances that matter." Professor Thompson's smirk faltered for just a second. He had misjudged her. Her responses were sharp, precise and well-reasoned, more so than any student he had encountered in years. He was losing control of the situation, and that made him angry. The class was now on the edge of their seats. Some students were visibly shocked by Maria's sharpness, while others were rooting for her, hoping that she could bring down the arrogant professor. But there was an undercurrent of tension in the room. Something shifted in the air. The professor wasn't just playing a game anymore. He was fighting to maintain his dominance, to keep the balance of power intact. And every answer Maria gave chipped away at that power. "Impressive," he said, though his words were tight. He wasn't ready to back down, not just yet. "But let's see how you handle this one. The principle of actus reus requires both the act and the intention behind the act to be proven. True or false?" Maria paused, her gaze never leaving his. Her mind flashed through every case study, every textbook she had studied. She had already mentally prepared for these kinds of tests, ones that weren't designed to test knowledge, but to break a student's spirit. "True," she replied, her voice calm and assured. "The actus reus requires the physical act, and the mens rea, the intention, must be proven separately. A person cannot be convicted of a crime unless both are established beyond a reasonable doubt." The professor's expression hardened. This was no longer a game, it was a battle. The more Maria answered, the more his arrogance faltered, and he couldn't allow that. Not in front of the class, not in front of anyone. "Let's make this more interesting," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "If you answer this one wrong, you'll have to publicly apologize to the class for wasting their time." Maria's heart skipped a beat, but her resolve didn't waver. This was her moment. This was her chance to prove that she wasn't some silent, meek student. She wasn't going to let him have the last word. "Bring it on," she replied, her voice steady, her eyes locked onto his. The challenge had been set. Now the real battle was about to begin. Professor Marcus Thompson leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping the desk rhythmically, a knowing smirk on his face. He had been anticipating this moment for weeks. Maria Santos, quiet, unassuming, had become the subject of whispers, with rumors circulating about her astonishing intellect. And yet, every time he looked her way, she sat still, a shadow in the back of the room, never drawing attention to herself. It irritated him to no end. This, game truth or lie, was his way of putting her in her place. He was the master here. No student, let alone a young girl from a modest background, could possibly outshine him in his own domain. The stakes were simple. He would pose a statement, and Maria, with all her so-called brilliance, would have to determine whether it was true or false, backing it up with reasoning. The rules were straightforward. This was no more than a harmless test of knowledge. The class settled into an uneasy quiet, all eyes on the professor, waiting for his next move. Maria, however, stayed calm, her eyes fixed ahead, betraying no hint of fear. She had anticipated this challenge, though perhaps not with such blatant arrogance. Professor Thompson began the game with what he believed would be an easy question, one that would force Maria to stumble. "The sky is blue," he said with a smug grin, almost daring her to question it. Maria didn't hesitate. "False?" she answered calmly, her voice cutting through the room. The professor's brow furrowed in disbelief. The students looked at one another, some in confusion, others already sensing the tension in the air. The professor's face twisted into a puzzled frown, trying to maintain his composure. "Explain yourself, Maria," he said, trying to recover his authoritative tone. "The sky isn't inherently blue," she explained, her voice steady. "The color we see is due to the scattering of light. Shorter wavelengths of light, such as blue, are scattered more than longer wavelengths. This phenomenon, called Rayleigh scattering, gives the sky its blue appearance, but technically it's not blue, it's a scattering of light." The class was silent. The professor blinked, taken aback. The answer was more precise than he had expected. His mind raced, trying to refute her, but he couldn't. He cleared his throat, recovering his posture. "I see. Well, perhaps you've memorized your science textbook. Let's see how you handle this next one." He paused, studying her with a mixture of suspicion and fascination. Maria remained unfazed. "The earth is flat," he said, his voice dripping with mockery, as if daring her to make the same mistake that so many others before her had. Maria's response was instantaneous. "False?" she said firmly. "The Earth is an oblate spheroid. It's slightly flattened at the poles and bulges at the equator due to its rotation. This has been proven through centuries of observation and scientific evidence, from the voyages of explorers to satellite imagery." The professor's smirk faltered, but he quickly masked his surprise with a dry chuckle. "Ah, yes, a textbook answer again," he said, though the words felt hollow coming from his lips. He looked to the rest of the class, hoping to regain control. But they were watching Maria intently now, their eyes wide, clearly impressed. "What's next, Professor?" Maria asked, her tone almost playful, as though she had already won this small battle. The challenge had shifted. It was no longer just about the game. It was about something much deeper. Professor Thompson, now visibly unsettled, threw another statement at her. "Humans use only 10% of their brains." This time, Maria didn't immediately respond. Her gaze drifted toward a chalkboard, where equations from their previous lessons still remained. The room was tense, and the professor's eyes narrowed, thinking that he had finally cornered her. After a long pause, Maria spoke. "False," she said softly, but with undeniable certainty. "This myth has been perpetuated for years, but modern neuroscience shows that humans use virtually all parts of the brain. Even during sleep, different areas of the brain are active, whether it's for memory consolidation, emotional regulation, or regulating basic bodily functions." The room gasped. The professor's expression hardened. He hadn't expected her to know that. He had assumed the myth would be a trick that she would fall for. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, gripping the desk with white-knuckled fists. His plan to humiliate Maria was backfiring, and his growing frustration was palpable. "All right, Maria," he said, his voice now clipped, trying to maintain control. Let's test your knowledge on something more in your area of expertise, legal. Principals, let's see if you can handle this one. A slight smile touched Maria's lips, but she didn't respond. She was ready. The law of contracts in the United States is identical to that of the United Kingdom, he said, now fully aware that his earlier arrogance had put him in an uncomfortable position. This statement, he thought, was broad enough that she would have to choose her words carefully. Maria's gaze sharpened. False, she said, her voice unwavering. The principles of contract law in both countries may share similarities, but they differ in significant ways. For example, in the UK, the consideration for a contract must be something of value, but in the US, contracts can be enforceable even without consideration in certain circumstances, such as in a promissory estoppel. The legal doctrines of offer and acceptance also vary. This was no longer just a game. The professor's face flushed a deep red, and his gaze hardened. Maria wasn't just answering questions. She was dismantling everything he stood for, one answer at a time. Every response was like a carefully placed strike, and he couldn't hide his growing panic. Trying to keep his composure, he continued, though his voice trembled slightly. All right. Perhaps I underestimated you. But there's more to this game than knowing random facts, isn't there? You've got one more question, Maria. Maria stood a little straighter, her eyes never leaving his. She had come this far. She wasn't going to stop now. Professor Thompson leaned forward, his hands pressed flat against the desk, his face inches from hers. The next statement is this: I am the smartest person in this room. The class held its collective breath, and for the first time, Maria felt the weight of the question. It wasn't a factual statement. It was a challenge to her very existence, to her worth, to the space she had carved out in this room. It was no longer about facts. It was about power, dominance, and a battle of wills. The silence between them stretched on, the tension suffocating. Maria opened her mouth, but what came out wasn't just an answer. It was a declaration. False, she said, her voice clear and steady, as if she had already won. The professor's face went pale. The words hung in the air, heavy and resolute. The tension in the room had reached a boiling point. Professor Marcus Thompson's sharp, smug smile was fading with each passing moment as Maria Santos continued to answer his questions with the kind of precision and depth that not only stunned him but threatened to upend the entire classroom dynamic. He could feel his grip on the situation slipping, his reputation as the untouchable authority in his domain beginning to falter. He had expected to crush Maria, to prove that no student, especially one so young and seemingly inconsequential, could challenge his mastery. But now, with every answer she gave, every legal principle she dissected with surgical precision, he felt the balance of power shift. The game, which had once seemed like a harmless test, now felt more like a battlefield, and he was losing. His heart raced, but he tried to mask his frustration behind a veil of condescension. His voice, though still authoritative, was laced with a hint of irritation. "Very well, Maria," he said, his tone clipped as if he were trying to control his emotions. "Let's see how you handle this one. The doctrine of consideration is the cornerstone of all contract law in the United Kingdom." The class shifted uncomfortably. It was clear that Professor Thompson had expected this question to stump her. It was a fundamental legal principle, one that most students could trip over, especially under pressure. But Maria didn't flinch. She merely raised an eyebrow, her gaze never leaving the professor's. "False," she replied smoothly. "While consideration plays an important role in the formation of a contract, it's not the only element. For a contract to be valid, there must also be mutual assent, capacity, and legality. Consideration alone doesn't make a contract enforceable." The students exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. Maria's answer was not only correct, but it displayed a depth of understanding that surpassed their expectations. Some students, who had originally sided with the professor, began to look at Maria with a new sense of respect. They had witnessed his earlier dominance, and now they were witnessing a shift they hadn't expected. The professor, the person they had long believed to be invincible, was now the one on the defensive. Professor Thompson's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edges of his desk. His attempt to humiliate Maria had backfired, and he could feel the eyes of the class on him, waiting for his next move. His usual confidence was slipping, and it was all because of this young girl who dared to answer his questions with such certainty. He straightened himself, his gaze locking onto Maria's, with a mixture of disdain and grudging admiration. "I see," he said, his voice now strained, "but let's move on to something more complicated, shall we? The rule against perpetuities is a concept that applies only in the jurisdiction of the United States." He watched her closely, his expression carefully controlled, hoping that this time she would falter. The rule against perpetuities was a complex, often misunderstood concept, one that could easily trip up even seasoned lawyers. But Maria, without a hint of hesitation, leaned forward slightly. "False," she said, her voice steady. "The rule against perpetuities applies in both the United States and the United Kingdom, though its application can vary. In both jurisdictions, the rule prevents property interests from lasting indefinitely and ensures that property is not tied up in ways that inhibit its transferability. While there are some exceptions, the principle itself is universal." The room was silent, except for the soft murmurs of students trying to process what they had just heard. Maria's answer was flawless. She didn't just know the legal concepts, she understood their practical applications, their roots, and their evolution over time. She was unraveling the professor's authority with every word she spoke. "Professor." Thompson felt the weight of the room's collective gaze pressing down on him. His attempts to undermine Maria had failed, and the students, once eager to see her fail, now looked at her with admiration, some even nodding as if they had just learned something profound. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, but he wasn't ready to surrender yet. He could still win. He had to. "Well then," he said, his voice tight, his smile returning, though it was tinged with frustration. "Let's see how you handle something. More de practical. In order to form an enforceable contract, the offer must be made in writing." The question hung in the air, and for a brief moment, the students grew still. This, they thought, was a trick. The professor had never before asked anything so simple, but the answer, they believed, would be tricky enough to catch Maria off guard. The class waited for Maria to stumble, but she didn't. She answered quickly, without hesitation. "False," she said, with the certainty of someone who had spent countless hours studying the nuances of contract law. While writing a contract is often preferable and sometimes required, such as in contracts related to real estate or the sale of goods, oral contracts can be just as binding in most circumstances, as long as there is mutual consent, consideration, and a lawful purpose. Her answer was a sharp jab to the professor's ego. The smug smile on his face began to crack as he processed her response. He had expected her to get caught up in technicalities, to overthink the question. Instead, she had sliced through it with an effortless understanding of the law's broader principles. The tension in the classroom was palpable. The students were no longer laughing or whispering amongst themselves. They were watching, captivated, as the professor's bravado slowly melted away. They had all been in awe of Professor Thompson's knowledge, but now they were beginning to realize that Maria was no ordinary student. Her intellect, her understanding, and her calm demeanor were slowly turning the tables. She wasn't just answering questions, she was dismantling the professor's authority piece by piece. Professor Thompson, now visibly flustered, tried to regain control of the game. His usual tactics weren't working. He had thrown some of the most complex legal questions he could think of at Maria, and each time she had answered them with a clarity that left him stunned. He knew he had to dig deeper, but there was a growing realization within him that this wasn't just a battle of knowledge anymore. It was a battle for respect, And Maria, with each answer, was earning more respect than he had ever anticipated. "All right. Maria," he said, his voice now edged with frustration, "let's try one more, something that might actually trip you up. The principle of stare decisis means that all cases must follow the precedent established in earlier rulings." Maria took a deep breath. She could feel the eyes of the entire class on her. The stakes were higher than they had ever been. She had already answered every question with precision, but this was different. This was more than just a test of her legal knowledge. It was a test of her ability to stand her ground in the face of the professor's ego. "False," she answered calmly. "Stare decisis means that courts are bound by previous rulings, but only when those rulings are relevant and applicable to the current case. Precedent can be overturned if the facts differ significantly or if a higher court rules differently. It's not a rigid rule. It's a guiding principle." The professor's face drained of color. For a moment it felt as if time had stopped. His students were no longer watching him with admiration. They were watching Maria with awe. The power had shifted completely. The professor's frustration had reached its peak, and there was no denying it. Maria had not only outwitted him, she had outclassed him. Professor Marcus Thompson's frustration had reached its peak. The smugness he once carried like armor was now a brittle facade. Cracking with every answer, Maria Santos delivered. She had dismantled his carefully constructed game with a precision that left him scrambling for control. His mind raced, desperately trying to hold on to the last shred of authority he had in the classroom. Every question, every answer, had only revealed his own weakness. He stood at the front of the room, his fingers gripping the edge of the desk so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The class was silent, their attention now fully on Maria, waiting to see if she would finally slip up. But the more they watched, the more they realized that she wasn't just winning, she was teaching them something far more important. Professor Thompson had lost his footing, but he wasn't going to give up. He would win this, even if it meant pushing her to the edge. He would test her once and for all, ask her the hardest question, the one that would finally break her down. Taking a deep breath, he prepared himself for his final challenge, the ultimate test of her intellect. His voice was sharp, his tone colder than ever before. "All laws are fair," he stated, his eyes narrowing as he scanned her face for any sign of hesitation. He knew that this was no ordinary statement. It was a trap, a loaded question. He expected her to stumble, to falter. It was an impossible question to answer, and he would finally have the upper hand. The students shifted in their seats, the air thick with anticipation. Maria's eyes flickered up to meet his, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her response. The professor was waiting for her to hesitate, for a crack in her composure, but it never came. "False," Maria said, her voice steady and unwavering. The professor's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. "False?" he repeated, his voice a little louder than he intended. "You think all laws are unfair?" Maria didn't flinch. She stood tall, her confidence now undeniable. "Yes," she continued, "because not all laws are fair by their very nature. There are countless laws throughout history that have been deemed discriminatory or unjust, laws that have oppressed entire groups of people, laws that have been overturned precisely because they were unjust, laws such as the segregation laws in the United States, apartheid laws in South Africa, or even the laws that once denied women the right to vote. These laws were deemed fair by the systems that created them, but they were not fair by any reasonable moral standard. The fact that they were once laws does not mean they were just." A stunned silence filled the room. The professor's face turned a shade paler. He had expected her to falter, to question the complexity of the statement, but Maria had done more than just answer the question. She had dismantled the very idea that all laws, by their nature, are inherently fair. The precision of her reasoning was flawless. Professor Thompson's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to speak, but found no words coming out. He wasn't just losing the game, he was losing himself, the tight grip he had maintained over his Ego and his authority had slipped through his fingers, and now all that was left was the burning realization that this 14-year-old girl, this quiet, seemingly inconspicuous student, had outwitted him at every turn. He could feel his facade crumbling, the reality of his failure sinking in. "Are you implying," the professor began, his voice shaking with frustration, "that all laws are inherently corrupt?" He was grasping for something, anything, to reassert himself, but his words sounded weak, as though he were trying to hold a flood back with a sieve. Maria didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at him not with disdain, but with a quiet understanding that cut deeper than any retort could. Her gaze was steady, unshaken by his challenge. She knew what he was trying to do. He was trying to turn the tables, to make her the one who looked unreasonable. But she wasn't going to play that game anymore. "Professor Thompson," she said, her voice calm but resolute, "laws are not absolute. They reflect the values of the time and place in which they were created. Some laws serve justice and others serve power. We cannot confuse the existence of a law with its fairness. Just because something is sanctioned by the law does not make it right. History has shown us that." The professor's face flushed a deep red. He opened his mouth again, but no words came. The students were watching, captivated, as the balance of power shifted completely. Maria was no longer just answering his questions. She was challenging his assumptions, his arrogance, and his inability to see beyond his own limited perspective. "You've made a game out of this, Professor," Maria continued, her eyes narrowing slightly as she addressed him directly. "But this isn't just a game. You've spent your whole life convincing yourself that your knowledge makes you invincible, that no one could possibly know more than you, that no one could challenge your authority. But all you've done is expose your own limitations, your own biases. You've built your career on the idea that you're the smartest person in the room, and now you're terrified of being proven wrong." Professor Thompson felt his chest tighten. The room felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on him. He had always been the one in control, the one who set the rules. And yet, here was Maria, a 14-year-old student, unraveling everything he had worked for in a matter of minutes. She wasn't just winning a game, she was exposing the truth. His voice cracked as he tried to regain his composure. I am the authority here," he stammered, his tone faltering. "I've taught for years. I know more than you could ever—" "No," Maria interrupted softly, her words cutting through his rambling. "It's not about how much you know, it's about how much you're willing to learn. And you, Professor Thompson, have stopped learning. You've stopped questioning. You think you have all the answers, but all you're doing is proving how little you truly understand." The room was silent. The students looked at each other, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time, they saw Professor Thompson for what he truly was, a man trapped by his own ego, unable to accept the possibility that someone, especially someone like Maria, could challenge his authority. Professor Thompson stood there, his face pale and twisted with a mixture of shame and anger. His earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by the cold, hard truth. Maria had won. Not just the game, but his respect, his dignity, and perhaps even his soul. As the bell rang and the students began to file out of the room, Maria turned to leave, but paused at the door. She didn't look back at the professor. She didn't need to. The game was over. And for the first time, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: peace. Professor Marcus Thompson stood at the front of the classroom, his shoulders sagging, his hands gripping the desk so tightly that his knuckles were turning white. The game had ended, but it hadn't ended in the way he had imagined. Maria Santos, the young girl he had dismissed as a mere shadow, had shattered his carefully constructed facade of intellectual superiority. He had entered this game with the confidence of someone who had taught for decades, someone who was untouchable in the classroom. But now, with each answer she gave, his authority had crumbled. She had not only answered his questions, she had outclassed him. His mind raced, desperately trying to find a way to regain control, to prove to himself and to the class that he was still the authority. But the words stuck in his throat. There was nothing left to say. The truth of it hit him like a punch to the gut. He had lost. Not just the game, but something far more significant: his ego, his control, and his place in the classroom. The man who had prided himself on his knowledge and power was now speechless, standing before a 14-year-old girl who had shown him just how little he truly understood. Maria, on the other hand, didn't bask in the victory. She didn't boast or gloat. There was no need. Her victory had been silent, dignified, and absolute. As the professor stood there, defeated and unsure of what to do next, Maria calmly gathered her things, her movements precise and measured. Her expression was unchanged, as though this moment was nothing more than another step in her journey, not a defining victory to be celebrated. The class, once full of skepticism and doubt, was now utterly silent. Every student, no matter how they had viewed Maria before, was now forced to reckon with the reality of her intellect. Some looked at her with admiration, while others struggled with a sense of shame. They had all watched as she systematically dismantled the professor's arrogance, proving that brilliance wasn't confined to the boundaries of age, gender, or background. As Maria stood up to leave, there was an unmistakable shift in the room. Some students leaned in, their eyes wide with a newfound respect. Others exchanged glances, a mix of awe and embarrassment on their faces. They had underestimated her, and now they were confronted with the uncomfortable truth. She was their intellectual equal, if not their superior. Professor Thompson's gaze followed Maria as she walked toward the door, her steps calm and purposeful. For a brief moment he considered calling out to her, to try and salvage some of his dignity, but the words never came. He had no argument left. All he had was the harsh reality that, for once, someone had proven him wrong. Someone had made him question everything he had built his career on. As the door clicked shut behind Maria, the professor remained standing at the front of the class, his face pale and worn. The students slowly began to rise from their seats, some gathering their belongings, others still lost in thought. The once dominant figure in the room was now nothing more than a man standing in the wake of his own collapse. But the shift in power wasn't over. The students had seen something they hadn't expected to witness: a quiet, unassuming young girl who had stood up to the system that had always been built to protect the powerful. They had watched as she outsmarted their professor, not through sheer force of will, but through quiet confidence, relentless determination, and an intellect that could not be ignored. She really did it, one student whispered to another, as, if trying to make sense of what had just happened, she made him look like a fool. Another student nodded, a look of disbelief on his face. I didn't think she had it in her. I mean, she's just a kid. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Maria's victory wasn't just intellectual, it was a triumph of the underdog, a reminder that anyone, no matter their background, could rise above the expectations placed upon them. And for many of the students in that room, it was a wake-up call. They had watched someone they had all written off as insignificant prove them wrong, and in doing so, they had learned a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. As the students slowly filtered out of the classroom, Professor Thompson remained in place, his hands resting on the desk, his mind racing. There was no getting around it. He had been bested, not just in a game, but in a battle of ideals, of perspective, and the worst part was that he hadn't even seen it coming. His years of experience, his wealth of knowledge, had meant nothing in the face of Maria's quiet brilliance. In the hallway outside, Maria paused for a moment, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. She hadn't expected this to happen, not in the way it did. She had entered the game not to humiliate the professor, but to prove something to herself. She wasn't just a girl from a small town, a quiet student who stayed out of the spotlight. She was capable of more, much more. And in that classroom, surrounded by her peers, she had proven it. Not through words or grand gestures, but through the calm, methodical application of knowledge. As she stepped outside into the cool air, A sense of quiet satisfaction washed over her. The world might never see her as anything more than a quiet student, a shadow in the back of the room, but she knew who she was now. She had stood up to the most powerful person in the room and had won, not through defiance, but through understanding, and that, she realized, was the truest form of power. The sound of the door closing behind her echoed in the empty hallway, marking the end of the game and the beginning of something much more significant. Professor Marcus Thompson sat in the dimly lit solitude of his office, the door shut firmly behind him, as if to keep the weight of the world from pressing in. Too hard. The walls, lined with awards and certificates, seemed to mock him now, the gleaming plaques a cruel reminder of a career built on arrogance. He had spent years standing at the front of classrooms, delivering lectures with the confidence that he was the smartest person in the room. No one dared challenge him, and anyone who did was quickly put in their place. Until today. Today, everything had changed. He couldn't stop replaying the events of that class in his mind, the way Maria had answered each of his questions with such precision, the calmness in her voice that belied her age. His own words felt hollow now, empty echoes of a man who had thought himself invincible. A bitter taste lingered in his mouth as he reflected on the arrogance that had driven him for so long. He had assumed that intellect could be measured in simple terms, that experience and knowledge could never be undermined by someone as young as Maria. His dismissal of her, as just another quiet, unremarkable student, now seemed like a grave mistake. The truth was harder to swallow. He had underestimated her. Worse still, he had let his ego blind him to the possibility that someone might have more to offer than he had realized. As he leaned back in his chair, his fingers tracing the smooth surface of his desk, Professor Thompson's mind began to unravel. The layers of his own pride. He had built his career on proving others wrong, on maintaining control at all costs. But today, he had been forced to confront the reality that his greatest strength, his knowledge, had become his weakness. The very thing that had made him feel superior had also made him dismissive of others. His students, who once saw him as an infallible authority, now looked at him with doubt. They had seen a 17-year-old girl best him, and in doing so, they had lost faith in him. His reflection was interrupted by the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway. He wasn't ready to face the world outside. His office, his sanctuary, felt like a prison now, the silence pressing in on him. There was no escaping what had just happened. The defeat, the humiliation, it was all still fresh, still raw. In that moment, the professor realized something else. His students hadn't just seen his defeat, they had seen a different kind of strength, a strength that came from humility. Maria had won, not through boasting or aggression, but through quiet confidence and undeniable intellect. She had shown the class and him that knowledge wasn't something to be hoarded or flaunted. It was something to be shared, something that could elevate everyone around you. He let out a deep sigh, the weight of his introspection settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. It wasn't just his pride that had been wounded. It was his entire worldview. He had always believed that intelligence was something to be guarded, something that set you apart from others. But Maria had shown him that true intelligence wasn't about how much you knew. It was about how you used that knowledge to challenge assumptions, to break down barriers, and to lift others up. She had proved that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply be yourself and stand up for what you believe in. Maria stepped out of the building, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the ground. Her steps were purposeful, but her face remained calm, as if the storm of the day hadn't affected her at all. She had entered the game with one goal in mind, to prove that she was more than the quiet girl in the back of the room. She had done that and more. She hadn't just answered questions, she had shown the world her worth, not through boasting, but through intellect and conviction. As she walked away from the classroom, she felt the weight of the attention that followed her. The whispers of students who had once dismissed her now seemed to chase her every step. But Maria wasn't bothered by the attention. She hadn't played the game for their approval. She had played it for herself, to show that she didn't need validation from anyone. She had earned her place, not through the approval of others, but through her brilliance and her ability to challenge authority when necessary. She paused at the exit of the building, taking a moment to breathe in the fresh air. The world outside the classroom felt different now, somehow, more open, more expansive. Maria knew she had taken her first steps towards something much bigger than she had ever imagined, but there was no grand celebration in her heart, no need for applause. The victory had been quiet, personal, and in a way, enough. Her mind wandered back to the professor. He had been her antagonist, the person who had pushed her to prove herself in front of the class. But she didn't feel satisfaction at his defeat. In fact, she almost felt a pang of sympathy. His arrogance, his refusal to acknowledge anyone else's worth, had been his undoing. But Maria understood that kind of pride all too well. She had spent years hiding her abilities, afraid that they would make others uncomfortable or threaten those who felt more entitled to success. Today, however, had shown her that the only way to truly succeed was to embrace who you were, without fear, without apology. As she turned to leave the campus, the weight of the day began to settle in, and with it came a sense of peace. She had not just proven herself to others, she had proven something to herself. She was capable of more than she had ever realized, and that knowledge would be the foundation of everything she did from here on out. The door to Professor Thompson's office stood ajar, but inside, the man who had once commanded the room was left alone with the remnants of his shattered pride. He had learned a painful lesson today, one that would haunt him long after Maria had walked away. The lesson was simple. True intelligence wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room or the one with the most knowledge. It was about understanding, when to listen, when to step back, and when to let others rise. And in that moment, as the professor sat in his office, contemplating his own limitations, he knew that the world had changed around him. The old ways, the arrogance, the assumptions were no longer enough. In the end, it wasn't just Maria who had learned something that day. The professor had learned too, and perhaps for the first time he was beginning to understand that true strength lies not in what you know, but in your willingness to grow and adapt.